Hello developers, welcome to my video series on Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on workflow. Today we are going to apply what we learned about PBR, physically based rendering, and the metallic roughness workflow in the previous two episodes and apply it to the Microsoft Flight Simulator material parameters in Blender. We will see how Substance Painter generated PBR textures that fit into the material parameters panel that is part of the Asobo Blender exporter. We'll review the shader node structure and the exported MSFS underscore variables. These can be viewed in the custom parameters panel. Thanks for watching all these three videos. I know how this subject can be.
The reptile-like Saurischia.
You have used Substance Painter to generate the PBR textures needed for your aircraft. How do they get used in Blender to be exported to the sim? Open the DA62 sources folder and find the textures. And look at the naming. There are files there with ALBD and comp and norm in their names, such as these ones. Remember we said that we will take the maps like the base color, the metallic, the roughness, the ambient occlusion, height, and normal, and make these into textures and use them from Substance Painter or the program of your choice. Those textures that are in the DA62 sample are a result of those maps. The ALBD texture are created from the base color maps or in the RGB color. The comp texture is a combination of AO, roughness, and metallic. AO is grayscale, metallic is grayscale, and the roughness is grayscale. But a texture needs RGB, red, green, blue channels. So the AO, R, and M single grayscale values are stuffed into the individual RGB channel values of the comp texture. We put three maps into one texture. The normal map is an RGB texture, so it's a 1-for-1. And the normal map may be part of a height map. Substance does this conversion for you during the export process from Substance Painter. The SDK docs have a number of sections devoted to materials. It's a huge section, has lots of information. There are terms that you may now recognize because you watched my previous two tutorials or you just know. So you can view the materials here in the external asset. 3ds Max plugin and materials gives you the main ones. You can look at the materials in here. So there's material contrast, material mapping, and then materials, and all sorts of information on materials in the simulator. Let's look at the DA62 textures in GIMP. The ALBD one looks typical. We've got a color, a base color for all the parts of the aircraft, the blue part, a gray part, white, yellow, black, darker gray, different colors that are used, and each one is a separate channel, RGB, and a typical RGB texture. If we look at the comp texture here, we have three channels again, red, green, blue, but each channel represents a different map, where the red channel represents the ambient occlusion, the green channel represents the roughness, and the B channel, blue channel, represents metallic. So if we turn off the green and the blue channels, we see a red channel. This is the ambient occlusion, and you can see dark areas here, which represent shadows, where light usually doesn't get to. So ambient occlusion, dark would be a shadow, and a bright red would be a bright spot on the aircraft. It's only represented here in red because we are actually looking at the red channel in GIMP. Really, this would be a grayscale from 0 to 1, 0 being black and 1 being white. So you can think of this red as white in that particular case if it's a grayscale. If we turn that off and we look at the green channel represents roughness, where a white or 1 or bright green would represent a rough area, and a darker color or a darker green, 0, would represent a non-rough area or a smooth area. And then if we look at the blue channel, which is metallic, the white or a light colored blue would be metallic, and the darker color or black would be non-metallic or dielectric. So you put all these colors together, and that's why you get this particular view of this texture. It's all red here because there is not much green here. It's all dark, and there's not much blue here. So blue metallic and a non-rough or shiny area here, and that represents the area of the fuselage that's blue. The normal map is a typical normal map where it's that blue-green color, where you have some parts that are green, some parts that are blue, and it's a typical looking normal map. And in this case, it's a DirectX normal map. It's time to get on my high horse here for a second or two. I see a lot of threads about textures and materials in the sim where it goes like this. My textures in the sim don't look the same as they do in Substance Painter or in your favorite texture program or in Blender. Why? Well, I can be flippant and say, well, there's 3 different programs, so of course they're not going to look the same. They're going to look different. But that does not answer the question why. You have exported your Blender file to FBX for importing into Substance Painter. So now you painstakingly work on these textures and you export them from Substance Painter correctly. I mean, you have exported them all as ALBD, comp, and norm with the proper RGB and grayscale maps and channels. Well, that's the first check. Here are the Substance Painter texture export settings. And you can see that we've set it up for the ALBD, albedo, comp, and normal textures are given their names. And the albedo texture is an RGB from the base color input map. There's an alpha channel from the opacity map. The comp is the different individual RGB channels. The R is from the mixed AO. The G is from the roughness, and the blue channel is from the metallic. The normal is another RGB, and it's a DirectX normal. Now you open Blender and you set the material for the thing you just worked on in Substance Painter, and you add the textures, the ALBD, comp, and normal, and yetch. It just doesn't look the same. I'm just going to set things to standard here, and you know that it sets up all the nodes and links for all the settings here. And we can add textures if we like to in this spot. Lasobo has set up all of the default parameters for the Microsoft Flight Simulator parameters here for the standard type. So you have a white base color, you have a black emissive, you have some UV options here. The important ones are the general parameters. There's a metallic factor, there's a roughness factor, there's a normal scale, there's detail information, there's an emissive scale. We haven't talked about emissive textures yet. They're basically just textures that emit light on their own. We're going to deal with those later. You have pearlescence, then you have your basic texture slots here where you're going to put the textures. Your textures from Substance Painter are from that program which has a certain lighting and a certain settings that are not going to match what is in Blender, and perhaps the information here won't get translated to the simulator exactly the same. All of these default variables and parameters might not be the proper setting. This means it will look different. You now need to set these parameters so that the objects look like you expect to look in the sim. So you can change the metallic factors, or you can change the roughness factors, and you can change the material. So let's open those textures that we saw. Just put them on the cube. The comp and the normal. Doesn't look like a DA62, but there you have the information on the cube itself, and you can kind of see things here. They're a bit shiny. Maybe it's too shiny. So you would change the parameters for all of these factors. Zero metallic, full roughness, no roughness, or smooth. You can see how it becomes more and less shiny. So all of these parameters are going to affect how it looks in Blender and how it will be exported to the sim. This will be different from the way it looks in Substance Painter. Remember, Blender has its own renderer that will not be the same as Substance Painter or the sim. It's close but not exact. You export your model and the textures are copied over to your package sources folder. The exporter does this automatically. I've created a test cube and exported it as a test plane. Open the sim and build the project. You should also realize that the build process changes your PNG files to DDS files. Another slight change for your textures. You look at the sim textures and you say, yet again, boy, this is aggravating. So back to Blender, fine tune, export, rebuild, repeat. This is the life of a developer. There's no hard and fast rule. So many textures and lighting conditions, so many ways for things to go wrong. So creating textures is one of the most difficult parts of the add-on development. So my cube here in Blender looks like this in the sim. Not quite the same. Where are my three dots? Well, that's the emissive part. It's kind of a little extra feature that we never really talked about in PBR. What about emissive textures? Well, the emissive textures are textures that give off light. So let's see what we can do here. What happens when we go to nighttime? Nothing. I have an emissive texture. Why doesn't it show? Well, let's see what we can do. Probably maybe because I have the incorrect texture for, or incorrect color for the emissive. Let's make it white. And then I will export again. Okay, I've changed my emissive color here, and I've exported, and now I get my 3 dots. So these are things that you're going to have to play with and understand when you're doing your aircraft and exporting it from Blender and rebuilding it into the sim here. So we have this, and I have some emissive lights on my cube there. You can kind of see the color. Change the daytime. There they are. They're a little too bright for the daytime also, but this is what you're going to have to do when you're building your aircraft. Let's review the Microsoft Flight Simulator Material Parameters panel in Blender. So here we have the parameters panel in Blender, and right now it's set to disabled. That just means that there are no MSFS materials applied to this cube. However, behind the scenes, there are default MSFS variables that are being set. If you export this cube, you will see something. You'll see a white cube. And if we change the base color of the texture of the surface panel, so there's the base color, we'll change it to something there, that's all right. And you can export that and you can view it in the sim. Here we've taken this and we've exported it to the sim, and it looks basically the same. But we have no Microsoft Flight Simulator material set to it. Well, this is because there are default values already set, and it will build the information so that we can see it in the sim. The Asobo exporter uses the core Chronos code in Blender to do things. We can add a normal texture to it and set it to a roughness if we want, and then export it. Okay, and I've exported the cube and I've added some normal information to it. This is how it looks in Blender, and here's how it looks in Sim. Not too bad. We've got some bumps here, and let's get rid of that. We have some, oh, we don't have any bumps here. I don't know if you can see that, but those are dents rather than bumps. It's difficult to look at, but there's a difference between what you see in Blender compared to what you see in the sim. So what is the difference? Well, it's the green channel. It's flipped. So in one, it looks like a dent, and in the other, it looks like a bump. It's flipped where one has a 1, the other one will have a 0, and where the other has a 0, the other one will have a 1. The Asobo exporter and the Microsoft Flight Simulator Materials panel make the normal texture behave as expected. So you would have to set the MSFS material to something for this to work properly. So what we'll do to fix this is we'll change this to a standard texture, and I'll try to get all the information the same. So let's make this that color. Probably have to add the normal back in. The normal texture has to come back. And now that looks better. I believe we have bumps where we should. And the reason for that is there's one node that is used to set up the way it presents it to Blender. So that normal color comes in and the red channel looks like this, and the green channel is flipped, and the blue channel. So the green channel is flipped so that in Blender it thinks it's an OpenGL normal texture, but really it's a DirectX with things flipped. So what you would see at the OpenGL, if these weren't here, would be the indents, and now everything looks right. So this node does the flipping, and I always recommend that you use the Microsoft material panel here to make any changes. So we made a change to the base color here, we made a change by adding the normal, and then this information is automatically done and set. The reason that the previous settings worked without all of these is due to these custom properties here, and all of these Microsoft MSFS type of information is behind the scenes and is set so that we got that cube before and it worked out. But the best thing for you to do is to always use the Microsoft Material Parameters panel and do all your manipulation here. Let's set the material back to disabled. It wipes out everything here, resets all of the custom parameters, and you get back to a white cube here. So we want to look at the material settings in the SDK. Again, it's in the 3ds plugin area. So under external asset creation, 3ds plugins, the materials, all of the materials we're going to talk about is here. So we always use the flight sim materials, and there's a list like that in Blender. So we have a list of all of these materials in Blender. So if we look in Blender, these materials are all here. And looking at materials, we have all the material types on the side here. So standard, decal, glass, windshield, environment, and so forth. It's a one-for-one in the listings here in Blender. So if we start scrolling through some of this stuff here, you can see that the references are all made in relation to 3ds Max, but you can make it out that there is a version here in the Blender plugin. So they have some information, but very minimal information on the Blender plugin. It's best for you to look at the materials that are in 3ds Max and make reference to that. The unique in-container inheritance, it's not supported in Blender, but really is that the unique ID? I'm not sure, but it indicates whether this is part of the Blender plugin or not. Animated materials, not supported in the Blender plugin, but is supported in 3ds Max. I hope that this feature comes to the Blender plugin also. So the material types, we have those listed here. So standard, it gives you an idea of 90% of your project will be standard materials. All the other material types are specialized. We have decal, that'll be a common one you use, glass, of course, windshield, and then we get into really specialized stuff, the porthole, geodecal frosting, so clear coats. I haven't used clear coat yet. Parallax windows used for scenery developers when you're doing buildings, so you're trying to fake the interior of a building. Anisotropic, very specialized hair, the surface materials. Invisible materials, you'll use that a few times when you want to surround something with a larger object to grab, so to speak. Fake terrain, Fresnel effect is used on the props. An environmental occluder is a material type that you'll use so that when you land on grass, you aren't seeing the grass poke through the bottom, or when it's snowing or raining, it doesn't snow or rain inside your cockpit. You'll be using that. And ghost material I haven't used at all either. There's the base color and the emissive color. So we saw that in Blender, where you would have a base color and emissive color. Here there's a base color setting and emissive color setting in Blender. After that emissive color, we have alpha mode. This is usually set by the material that you choose. Most of the times it'll be opaque. Mask is not used. Blend is used with glass and windshield and transparent type colors or textures and so forth. Render parameters, so there's some good information here. What you have is the draw order, don't cast shadows, double-sided day-night cycle, and so forth. In Blender, you'll have those options here. You can have a draw offset and enter a number, and then check boxes for don't cast shadows, double-sided day-night, and disable motion blur. We have gameplay parameters, which includes collision material, road material. So scenery developers will use the road material and collision material. In an aircraft, you'll use it for collision objects in like your panel colliders and the VR colliders and so forth. More information on collision handling section. The UV parameters, I would just leave these as default. I haven't really had anything time to make any adjustments with the UVs. Talking about animated materials, we don't have that in Blender, so just leave those options as they are. Next is the general parameters, and this is where all of your work will be done. Basically, you will be manipulating these values here. So most of these parameters will change, and some you'll just leave as default. And you should also start recalling the things about the previous two episodes about PBR, the metallic and roughness workflow. So here is the roughness and metallic information that we'll be adjusting. And you can scale the amount of metallicness or roughness, and this will only affect the metallic or the roughness characteristics of your texture. So the underlying comp texture affects how this parameter affects either the metallic part, the dielectric part on one texture. Additional parameters here, normal scale, cutoffs, detail UV scale, detail UV offset, more scaling of the U and V and normals and blend thresholds. So in Blender, you have those options here. We went through the UV options, and here we have those general parameters and so forth that you can change to make your object change in the ways that you require and so forth. back to the SDK. So additional parameters down here for the color per decal component blend factors and so forth. Color and roughness for that. Metal, occlusion, normal, emissive. So again, the metal roughness workflow comes into that, even on the detailed textures, and we'll get into those later. There are lots of other general parameters, and they are specific for depending on what type of material you've looked or you've selected. So there you had the general parameters there. Then you have the decal per component blend factors, which are associated with decal and geodecal frosted. The glass parameters specific to glass. Standard has pearl parameters. Parallax Windows has parallax parameters. The Fresnel parameters for Fresnel fade. Ghost parameters again, and so forth. So depending on what material you have selected, the texture slots that you see in Blender. So if we look at the texture slots down here, there are a number of different slots with different naming. So standard texture, base color, ORM, occlusion, roughness, metallic, normal, emissive, and then the detail colors and detail normals, detail ORM, and the blend mask. So depending on what you've selected here, you get different textures that will appear in the in those materials. So a base color is on the standard decal, porthole, glass, fake terrain. Occlusion, roughness, and metallic is part of that, those ones. And then normal is part of these. That's how you read this. So normal, emissive is part of that, the detail color. And so that relates back to the Blender options that you see here. So when you continue down, and when you get into the geodecal frosted version, it says that you can have base color, and it makes a reference to it. It doesn't automatically recite everything from the base color again. So geodecal frosted has those which were previous, plus it has a new one called a melt pattern roughness metallic slot. In Blender, if I change that to geodecal frosted, so I change the material here to that, it automatically changes the slots to that. And you can see melt pattern roughness is now part of that texture slot with detail normal and detail color. Clear coat does the same thing. So all of this is the same except for you get a clear coat. So clear coat, geodecal frosted, you have a new clear coat, and we'll change that. So you kind of get the idea. Clear coat again, very specialized. And here you have a additional clear coat amount, which you saw in here. The windshield texture, that's a very, very complicated texture now. It has a lot of information, and a lot of textures do a lot of different things for the windshield. So windshield basically does the same thing as all of the other textures, and there's only three common. Base color is used the same, ORM is used the same, and normals are used the same. But with Windshield, a lot of the other texture slots have changed. And there's a lot of information here that is related to how the Windshield texture is used. In Blender, if I change this to a Windshield texture, change the base color, give it some alpha to make it transparent, and you'll notice that all of the texture slots down here have changed. Still have base color, ORM, and normal, but instead of the emissive, we have a secondary details alpha. And that texture is used to add layer on top of the windshield to use the alpha channel only. The UV maps are not affected. So basically you have a texture where it doesn't use the RGB part, but it does use the alpha part. Detail scratches, icing mask, and fingerprints can be done with that texture. So this is a combination texture here where the R channel is the scratch channel, scratches, the icing channel is the G channel, and the fingerprints are the B channel. So detail scratches, icing mask, fingerprints, when you put them all together, you get this greeny looking texture that you'll put on your windshield. The UV mapping for that, so that the rain travels in the correct direction, you have to make sure that your UV mapping is correct. There is now an icing normal, and the icing normal in Blender is here. So you have an icing normal texture, and that's additional normal to give you the bumpiness for icing. Then you can use vertex alpha and vertex colors. I have a separate video on how to use vertex alpha and vertex colors. Just look in my YouTube channel and you should be able to find out. It's a detailed analysis of how to set that all up. So after the windshield, we have parallax. Again, they use the same textures for top three textures, and then specialized information for parallax. I haven't got any videos on how to do that. There are some videos out there on how this can be accomplished. I think FS Developer has that information. And then more specialized textures again. Anisotropic uses all the same texture slots, but again has an anisotropic direction texture slot. Hair, subsurface scattering, Fresnel fade are all pretty basic again. I was able to get the Asobo GLTF material data into a blend file, and this shows most of the MSFS materials both in Blender and in the sim. So all of the different file types or material types that you have here are now shown in real time, so to speak. And if I export this file and get the program to build it in sim, we have this. So as you can see, some things don't show. The environmental occluder doesn't show, and that's expected. The windshield, well, it's there somewhere. Invisible, of course, it's invisible. But everything else kind of shows, except for maybe the geodeclifrosted. But we can easily fix that because that has functionality based on icing. So if we turn on the icing appears on the skin of the cowling and on the windows. So that type of thing is working. And then we can see that the Fresnel effect, if I move in a little closer, I'm using the drone camera, so excuse me while I get this working here. So yeah, so the Fresnel effect on a prop is seen. You can see from the side, etc. So if we look at some other things, you can see that the hair and the hands are working. And let's go over to the portholes there. So as we get closer to a window, you can kind of see that there's some parallax viewing on that. And the seats, I don't know if you can see that. So that type of thing, all that functionality is there working in the sim. I couldn't get the parallax windows to work, but I'll figure that out at a later time. So that's what you get when you take the blend file that you have. Here, all this information, you see the invisible, you can kind of see it, environment occluder. Everything shows in Blender, but in the sim, it acts the way it should. Well, there you have it. A look at the PBR textures and the Microsoft Flight Simulator materials. It was just an overview and a very cursory look at everything. I suggest that if you need some bedtime reading, that this is probably going to put you to sleep very quick. In our next episode, we'll start an aircraft add-on project, general aviation or GA aircraft. We'll download an aircraft from a 3D model source, and we'll work on its flight model, the exterior animations over a number of episodes, and we'll texture it, and we'll work on the electrical and systems and other config files. Well, good luck, and see you next time.